Hey everyone, this is Bill Mork with Quorum. Thanks again for joining today. I'm going to go ahead and kick off the presentation. The main topic is discussing the top disasters that are affecting different teams and organizations and which ones affect people the most often. We'll kind of walk through that list and discuss any changes that we're seeing. And also we'll discuss in each of those scenarios, what's a recovery strategy look like as well. Going through the presentation today will be Gabriel. He's our Quorum's VP of Technology. Again, if you have any questions as they're going through the presentation, please feel free to chat them, and I'll keep an eye out there and feed them to Gabriel as I can.
Great, thanks Bill. Hope everyone's having a good day today. We're going to talk about the most common disaster recovery scenarios that people are facing in 2022 and 2023. Now we're going into 2024 pretty soon, but as we're standing today, we're going to talk about what's current in the world that's happening, and we'll kind of dig into some of these a little more than others because some of them are pretty tried and true. So we'll kind of just walk through them here. First thing we're going to talk about is user error. It's still the most common, followed really closely by cyber threats, people trying to get into your network. Ransomware would be considered a cyber threat, and those type of activities. And how really user error and cyber threats are very closely related, because usually the way that a cyber criminal finds their way into your network is via a user error. So we'll talk about that overlap as well. We'll talk about hardware failures a little bit and things to lessen the impact of that maybe, but what you do when that happens. Power outages and the side effects of that, as some areas of the US and around the world are facing more and more power constraints, especially during hot summer months and cold winters. We'll talk about how they can mitigate some of those things. And then of course, lowest on the list, but really the largest kind of impact and people talk about is natural disasters. So we'll go through that. So first is user error. And I always bring this story up, but back in 2007, AWS was taken down for an entire afternoon because one of the developers who was just updating a very small and theoretically insignificant piece of code had a typo when he uploaded the code, and it took entire AWS down for multiple hours until they realized what had happened. The other one that's really big is in 2021, Facebook was taken down for 6 hours because, as all big companies do, they were being audited. So they were trying, I think it was their PCI audit that they were working through. And while they were going through that audit, one of the tools that's supposed to just scan servers for stuff literally took all of Facebook down for 6 hours. So those type of things are definitely impactful. This isn't even going through the person working at your company that clicked on the link they shouldn't have clicked on, or downloaded the app that had spyware on it, or any of those type of things. These were big and publicized ones, but they happen all the time. And it is the hardest thing to predict. It is the hardest thing to find when it happens. And it's usually the most impactful, to be honest. We talk about user error. Hey, I deleted a file by accident, and those are painful, right? You got to go dig out the file from backups and recover it. But when you take down all of AWS because of a typo, those are what we call job defining events. So we want to make sure that we mitigate those. And the best way to mitigate user error is constant training, constant reinforcement of your policies and procedures. As IT professionals, we're a little more intelligent about how we handle ourselves on a computer. So it's a little bit of an attitude that we get of do as I say, not as I do. And we have to be diligent to that because our users see that. They see us not following the rules and think it's okay for them. And so we have to make sure that, see as I do as I do, not do as I say. The next thing on our list is really cyberware, cyber threats and ransomware. boy, it's in the news all the time, and we hear about it every day. We did a presentation not too long ago about how you actually go about recovering from ransomware. And we've had customers that have gone through it several times. And it's interesting because the process of recovery is the easy part. It is the decision and the set of decisions that you have to make when you're attacked by ransomware to decide how you're going to recover, how you're going to communicate that recovery, that are really the most time consuming and the most unknown. In disaster recovery planning, a lot of the times the IT group goes away, creates their plan, tests their plan, and go, yep, we're ready. But when the disaster happens, almost none of the IT presence gets to make those decisions. It's always the executives in the company deciding how they're going to communicate, to whom they're going to communicate, whether it's public relations, communicating to users. Did you violate some kind of HIPAA law or PCI credentials type thing? Getting those decisions made are the hard parts. And so I always encourage anybody that I'm working with to make sure your disaster planning isn't just an IT function. It is a business function. And you sit down and you talk to the people in your company and your executives, and you storyboard for them. These are the impacts of what's going to happen. And take that time to make sure that we're talking about disaster preparedness, whether it be from a cyber threat or ransomware or anything else, as a function of how we do business. And that communication and that strategy has to be documented, and it has to be what you guys hold to in the event of a disaster. Ransomware is definitely on the rise, as we all know, and it is really approaching taking over the user error kind of category as the number one reason people are having a disaster in the world right now. We did a webinar not too long ago on the stance that the US government is taking and what they're doing going forward to help mitigate these attacks. And it's a real interesting webinar. I recommend if you guys can pull it up on YouTube or whatever and listen to it. A lot of information, we brought in some experts, and a lot of information was very valuable for companies to start building their plans around.
Well, like you said, Gabe, this cyber threat is, while it's starting to getting close to surpassing user error as the top disaster organizations are facing, I was reading, still user error is the big reason that leads to cyber threats as well, right? I was reading something from like 85 to 95% of cyber threat related outages are kind of initiated by some sort of user error from the onset. So.
For sure. We talk a lot about hacking. They hacked our systems and they got in. Everyone theoretically thinks, they got through the firewall and they got in our network, and they did. Well, most of the time, somebody did something that let them in. It's most of the time a user did something against policy, against plan, or just unknowingly that allowed these things to happen. One of the biggest things that we've come across and that we've seen in practical terms is 80% of people that were hit with ransomware were hit more than once. So they didn't learn from the mistake the first time, and they made a mistake again right alongside that. And that was a big revelation to us, because usually we imagine that if someone goes through a ransomware event, everything changes, but a lot of times it didn't. And that's a big red flag that you guys need to be aware of.
Definitely, it seems that lightning can strike twice here. I was also reading a lot of, I read one interesting piece of data that was saying since working from home, ransomware has increased. But what the part I found interesting was that it wasn't saying because of bring your own device or a more spread network or reasons that I would have suspected, but it was saying that distraction or being very busy is really common in almost all cyber threats. So someone's multitasking, they see an email, it looks like it's from the CEO, or, hey, this is really urgent, can you make this action for me? And that's kind of when slip-ups can occur. So that was interesting to note as well. So it's just, I'm sure we're all multitasking, but education and kind of just having our team take a break, take a breath, and ask IT administrator or whomever they should to check any of our suspicious emails before they take action. That's always great idea.
Agreed. And spear phishing, if you guys know what that is, spear phishing is definitely on the rise. These are targeted attacks. So a phishing attack is everyone in the company gets an email that says, hey, I'm the president and I need your social security numbers. And so everyone sends their social security number in, which you should never do, by the way. Spear phishing would be directed at the president that says something specific to him about something where he's likely to click on that link. It's a targeted attack specifically to get one person in a company to open their door and let the attackers in. And that is dramatically on the rise. So be very wary of emails that you're getting from any source about any item. Even if they're calling you by name, they have personal information about you already, you think that they know you, be on the lookout for those.
And I just wanted to, one more thing before we move forward. I just wanted to say, I with the White House address, and I think there's been a lot of awareness about ransomware as a service being organized crime. Particularly we're facing a lot of threats outside of the United States, which is tough for us to battle. But I read that it was something like 75% of ransomware events are financially motivated. So it's just a note for smaller organizations or teams out there thinking, well, I don't have I don't have any data that could be used against the US government. Sometimes these outside entities are just looking to make a financial impact and nobody's too small.
Oh, absolutely. A good example of that is 2 years ago in 2021, ransomware was considered an $8 billion industry. Not the people protecting from ransomware, but the attackers of ransomware. Worldwide, $8 billion industry. Right now, they consider it a $14 billion industry. So prices and the charge of ransomware are going up because they're successful. And they're making you pay for it. So the things you can do to mitigate that is definitely training. Train your users, talk to your users, make it an ongoing thing. And then the other thing you can do is make sure that I would recommend everyone get a security audit performed on their company, have pen testing done, have social networking testing done, so that you can see how well you're doing against these attacks. So the next one is pretty obvious, right? If you have a server and it has moving parts, eventually they fail. And hard drive failures over the last 20 years have been a pretty consistent pattern of they'll fail eventually. That's why they came up with things like RAID technologies and even things like scale out technologies where you're building across multiple servers to perform that kind of redundancy. It's going to happen. As we've moved to chip-based storage like SSDs or NVMe technology, people kind of started to feel, I don't need to worry about that because it's all on a chip. It doesn't have any moving parts. It's not going to fail like that. But that's not really true. While it is a lower failure rate, it's 25% of what a hard drive is. SSDs do fail. They have a life expectancy of how much data they can write and they can read over and over again, and they do wear out. Those ones and zeros that are written to that chip eventually do die. So be aware of that and start planning for those hardware failures as well. It does happen, and it's something to be protected for.
I guess maybe some good news here is we'll weigh in on this, Gabriel. Have you seen that supply chain and the chip shortage has become a manageable state, and then we can at least get the new hardware when and if we need it?
In some places, yes. Some like manufacturing channels have really opened up, but some have been impacted because people are now working from home. So for example, RAM for laptops is a lot harder to get than RAM for servers. Very similar technologies, almost identical, but sometimes that's the way they work out. Hard drives, because people are moving to NVMe's and M2 slots and all that kind of stuff, that's becoming a lot of the bottleneck as manufacturing is switching from the SATA and SAS connector style storage to this new PCI style technologies. So we're still seeing that transition taking time and causing shortages. Power outages and surges. The average cost of a power outage is about $1,500, and usually power outages are quick. And the reason that that's such a high number, you think, well, my power was only off for like a minute or 2 minutes. It's the impact that those power outages can have on server hardware or network environments. If you're not in a data center, if you have like just a UPS battery, you think you're immune to that. But a lot of people, what we're finding is they're not changing out their batteries because it's expensive. And so the batteries don't hold up to the power outage or surge. And so the server will go down, it will come back up with corruption. Or, it's instead of being an outage or a surge, it's a brownout where it's just lowering it enough to cause hardware malfunctions like power supply fans not spinning fast enough, the server overheats and it causes more extreme damage. These are things that we're seeing quite often, especially in warmer climates, and where they don't have, large battery stations, data centers. They're not upgrading their UPSs. They're just relying on a surge protector. Those type of environments really get hit often. Typically, oddly enough, we see this most in manufacturing environments where they have a server that sits in a room and it just does the manufacturing process and they never look at it, they never touch it. And one day it just stops and they don't know why. Usually it's because there was some kind of power event that caused that server to overheat and break. Last but not least is natural disasters. I'm not going to try to start a political conversation with anybody, but the whole climate change discussion kind of plays out in this world. Natural disasters have been going up year on year. We used to have in the world, on average, 5 to 6 natural disasters a year. And that was pretty consistent from the 70s when they started really looking at this right up through, current time. And right now, on average, like in 2022, we had 9, which is almost double what they used to have for natural disasters. And these are things like floods, fires, hurricanes, typhoons. That kind of activity has gone up over the last 5 to 6 years dramatically. And being aware of that, especially if you're in an area that is prone to that kind of natural disaster, tornadoes, you need to make sure that you're taking precautions and you're putting your data and your company's information in a position where it's either going to be recoverable after the fact or it's going to be mostly immune to that kind of activity. While this is a lot less frequent than things like ransomware, the impact of this is usually far greater, because if a tornado hit your building and took your servers out, it's not just the tornado. Now it's the location. It's, are your people safe? Are how, where, when are you going to work? All of those type of conversations are happening that are much more impactful longer term for these companies. And so having a good strategy where that at least is not one of the things you have to worry about is really critical. I recommend to clients that talk to me about this that, and I kind of said this earlier, when you're planning for a disaster and you're doing these kind of discussions, you're putting a BCP together, disaster planning, it is not just an IT function. It is a business function of which IT really plays a small part. And putting your plan together and your strategy so that you don't have risk, so that you don't have the impact to your people, is the most important part of these planning scenarios. So please take the time to do those and have those tough discussions. Hey, don't put your VP and your president on the same flight to Vegas for the trade show. if the worst thing happened and that flight went down, you don't want both of them on the same place. Those kind of discussions need to happen. And too often I see that it's an IT conversation and those don't happen. And those are the type of things that'll take a company out.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add in on this one is that it kind of relates back to the power outage, but something I know our clients have experienced last winter and the summer before is just extreme temperatures as well. You know, a very hot spells in the summer, which has caused mainly power issues, which can lead to connectivity issues. But also we had just a crazy winter as well. So again, to Gabe's point, it's maybe the least thought about or least likely to happen. When it does happen, it's super impactful and lasts for a while.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The next thing we're going to talk about is kind of how to prepare. What are the things you can do to better plan for a disaster scenario? And that's going to start with the obvious. Build a checklist. Talk about how your company operates, what the impacts of different disasters would be on your company. Understand what you want to accomplish. There's always going to be that scenario that nobody's thought about or that, you know, doesn't really apply to you, right? If you are a schoolhouse, you know, planning for a manufacturing disaster for products isn't going to be as impactful to you as a tornado. Those kind of conversations, though, have to happen. You need to build that checklist. You need to know what items can happen that will set you up that says, this is a disaster. We have to act like a disaster. We have to treat it like a disaster. There's no easy way out of this scenario. And those triggers need to be decided on. You need to define what means I'm in a disaster scenario, because that's going to help you when you're talking outside of your IT plan, but when you're talking about your disaster recovery insurance with, you know, your company's insurance and those kind of policies, you define those disasters with them as well, so that you know when you're in those scenarios and what qualifies for those scenarios, so that you take the right actions. Defining how you're going to work after the disaster or during the disaster is just as important as deciding when it's a disaster or not. So are you going to set up remote access, or how are you going to communicate with people? What if the phone systems are down? How do you get messages to folks? How do they know where to go, what to do? If it's a fire in the building, do you have a fire escape plan? How do you communicate who's in charge of what? Right? Who's in charge of the IT parts? Who's in charge of people communication? Who's in charge of public relations? Who's in charge of talking to the insurance companies? Or if you have ransomware, talking to law enforcement or the FBI? Those responsibilities need to be defined, and you need to have owners, and you need to have backups for those owners. If you have the IT director who's in charge of disaster recovery plan for your IT network and he's on vacation in Madrid, what are you going to do other than feel jealous that he's in Madrid? Building a minimum of 5 scenarios. So you want to test at least 5 scenarios a year. Now, I'm not talking a full DR test of 5 scenarios, but you have to have at least walkthroughs of these scenarios and discuss how you're going to react, what's going to happen, who you're going to talk to, what you're going to say. These are good planning patterns, methods, habits that you need to build, so that when and if you have a disaster, it is not such a sweep you off your feet moment, and the panic doesn't set in. That quote unquote muscle memory test needs to be there. And then of course you want to test as many scenarios as you can afford to test, as often as you can afford to test them. If you can test daily, super. If you can test once a year, great. But if you're not testing scenarios because it's too hard or it's too impactful, then you don't have the right kind of solution that allows you to get through these scenarios and succeed. And that's what's going to impact your business when and if they happen. Next page. There we go. Pre-planning checklist. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'm going to just kind of touch on a couple things. BCP planning documentation is super important. Have a business continuity plan. Have a way to communicate with your people. A lot of semi-large, 25 to 100 people companies or larger tend to set up 1-800 numbers. Like they'll apply for one of those voice over IP 1-800 number call bridges that they just pay the $10 a month and just have it on standby for a disaster. And everyone has that 1-800 number. And if you have a disaster, that's what you call in. And someone's responsible to sit there and be there on the call to give you information when you call in for it. It's a good strategy where you're not doing the kind of call tree methodology, and it keeps communication open, and it keeps people able to get solutions when they need to know what's going on. LAN-WAN diagrams, God, most underrated piece of IT equipment that you can have is a good, up-to-date LAN-WAN diagram. It provides so much information if you have a disaster. It is so impactful on knowing what affects what. I can't stress it enough that when you're doing a BCP plan or a planning checklist, that you have that information. It really makes everyone's world, because not everybody is your IT administrator in the server room every day, but it makes everyone's ability to understand the impact of what happens much more clear. So I would recommend everyone have that. Customer trainings, as often as you can afford to have. Training not just on cybersecurity threats, but what to do in a disaster, which numbers to call, having a little cheat sheet they can follow that they can, keep in the glove box of their car, so it's not in the building. Something that they know that they can use if they have a disaster. DR planning and DR testing would be the other thing that I would make sure that you focus on. DR testing is not just taking a server down and bringing it up on the on-queue, which of course you can do whenever you want. It should be a focus of what are the conversations we're going to have, what are the processes we're going to follow, how are we going to get from A to Z, save our company and get our users back up in a timely and safe fashion. So management tasks. After you put together that pre-planning checklist, you're going to have owners for different areas of your recovery plan. And you're going to have triggers and what's going to happen. And tasks for the management or these category owners are just as important as the planning that you do in general. Command centers, where you're going to work from, how you're going to work, how you're going to communicate, are the most important parts of a disaster recovery plan. Getting the servers back up, while complicated, I don't want to tell any IT person that it's not a hard task. It is, right? You're rebuilding a network. But it's all about how you're communicating that information, what the expectations are, setting those expectations, meeting those expectations, so that everyone understands the impact of what's happening. On the Quorum side, what we do is we're a disaster recovery product specifically designed for your server computer environment. We're designed to protect all of your servers. We back them up. We make virtual copies of those servers so that if you lose a site or a server, something's infected with ransomware, whatever the disaster is, according to your triggers, you can get those servers back up and running in the time it takes to boot. It's just click it, start it, and go. And the whole product is designed with disasters in mind. We can do all of the things like file level recovery and reporting and archiving and all of that stuff. It's all part of the product. But our focus is making sure that if you have a disaster, we are not the long straw that makes that process hard for you. We want to take the technical problems out of your disaster so that you can focus on the people. And you can make sure that your people are safe and your training is done and everyone is there the technology should be easy to recover. And so that's kind of what we do here at Quorum.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Gabriel. I thought it was an excellent presentation. Thanks to everyone who attended. If you think of any follow-up questions, we'll be reaching out to you just to get your feedback on the webinar. Happy to take any questions on this topic then. Also, we're always, keeping an eye out for other topics that people might have of interest, a new subject that has them scratching their head. So if you have any questions or subjects for future topics, be happy to gather those as well. Thanks again for attending, and Gabriel, thanks again for another great presentation.
All right, guys, you guys have a good one.